Here's one more thing I want to say about industry constraints is that in industry constraints, or I think of them as external constraints. The things we talked about before, individual, group, and organizational, are what I call internal constraints. Those are ones that you have a little bit of control over. You know, you have control over yourself, and there are things you can do to make groups behave a certain way, and even organizations. However, when you get to the industry level, there are all these other outside entities involved, and so it becomes much more difficult to do that kind of control. And so therefore, I'm going to call that the external constraint, as I am going to be calling the external, the societal and technical constraints we have next week and the following week after that. So again, these external constraints are ones that we can't necessarily control, but if we understand how they operate, we can actually get to a place where we can still do our innovation process mindfully in understanding that there are constraints present and that we just need to understand how they operate and how it is we can become strategic about getting around them. So the first of the industry constraints we're going to talk about is competition. So competition is when two organizations are trying to satisfy the same need in a market. And so they both try to do it in different ways. We're going to talk about rivals and rivalry, how two organizations or more actually try to compete to satisfy a need and what the implications are of that for innovation. We're going to talk about capital intensiveness, to what extent that we have to put capital in, and how that forms a barrier to innovation and barrier to entry of new things, but also sets up other interesting dynamics. And then we're going to talk about maturity and how organizations in an industry, as the industry matures, how their behavior begins to change in ways that actually pushes back or pushes down innovation. So the competitive environment is such that if things are highly competitive, we say, oh, we have to build a new product because they built a new product and we have to go back and forth. However, if an organization has monopoly power, for example, the way Kodak did, they become a little bit more slow. They become a little bit less interested in innovation because innovation is work and innovation is risk and innovation can represent even experiments that fail. And so why would you spend effort doing that if you don't have to? The other thing that will happen is as the speed of competition speeds up, it could be that competition speeding up actually helps innovation because we'll do something and they'll respond and they'll respond and they'll respond back and forth. But it could be also that speed of response, as it gets too fast, we sort of aren't able to address it. And so we may decide that let's sit back and wait. Let's become followers instead of leaders in the industry. So let's sit back and wait because it just changes too fast. And that can actually cause us to become a little bit out of touch, let's call it, out of touch with what's going on in the industry because we've sort of stayed back and we're trying to be a follower. The intensity of competition, it can increase innovation, like I just said. The speed of response, there's a push for lower costs, and those lower costs will actually cause us to, we have to innovate to achieve them, right? We have to become more efficient, and we have to become more quickly. However, some ways that we respond can also constrain innovation. Because as an organization in the industry, we'd like to stabilize the market. We'd like to keep pricing at a certain level. And we can do that in many different ways. So one way is to form alliances and form partnerships. As we connect to other organizations, and those organizations will allow us to address the market, but do it without having to actually run the risk of innovation. I'll give you a concrete example. At one point recently, AT&T, the mobile phone service in the United States, was going to acquire T-Mobile, because T-Mobile had this 4G network that AT&T didn't have. So AT&T was in a situation where they could actually build a new 4G network, or they could just buy it because someone already had one. And the forming of that alliance would actually allow AT&T to get to a new place, right, a more innovative place, but without actually doing the work of innovation. Unfortunately, for those two companies, that deal was killed by the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, because it was deemed as anti-competitive. And so that kind of innovation through alliances and partnerships, or the kind of squelching of innovation, the pushing down of innovation that would happen that way, was called out and said, you can't do it that way. And so there is something about this competition and about how it can cause us to be more innovative, but at the same time cause us to not want to seek competition. Think about it. Perfect competition, and if you've taken an economics class, perfect competition is what will lead to zero profits. Competition can also be very distracting. That is, as we're fighting with someone, as we're rivals in this industry trying to to fill this need, that others may pop up and may come in from somewhere else. Let me talk about new entrants into the market. So there's one thing to have the existing rivalry, so that's these organizations that we compete with that are already there, but what drives new entrants? What drives new competitors to come into a market? Well, one thing in mature markets, we have, let me just describe for a second, we have these performance standards. So in a mature market, we have understandings of what price is, what kind of performance we get for that certain price, or these kind of standards that people have. So if you're going to buy a computer, you know about how much it's going to cost because they're all sort of the same. That is what we call a mature market. Mature markets also end up with professional standards, right? They try to keep things so that they're able to address the market. So the needs, the understanding what a need is, like what does a person need in a phone, there's a very common understanding of that. It's almost towards a performance standing, but as a professional, we understand what those, as a professional in that industry, we understand what the needs are. We also have controls on knowledge of how people can move knowledge around in our industry. Our value chains are really focused on deriving high values of efficiency. That is, as we're mature, we become more efficient, we take waste out, and we're able to drive the price down, drive the cost down in that way, because price will slowly erode also, but we're able to drive the cost down. And then also, what we'll see then is new entrants coming in to our market. And so if you said, well, if there are all these things in place, all these kinds of performance standards, professional standards, value chains in place, how are new entrants going to come in? Well, they're going to come into places where there's low capital needs. So think about it this way, that if there's a industry that's being addressed, so for example, Kodak, right? Kodak had this photography industry. In order to compete on Kodak's terms, you'd have to have a lot of capital, right? You need all these machines all around, you need all this chemistry all around, you need all these chemical companies, you need all this knowledge, you need all these things in order to compete with them head on. So you're not going to do that. What you're going to do is you're going to come in a way that allows you to have very low capital needs. You're going to come in from the bottom. You're going to come in a slow way. And that's going to be the pattern of disruptive technology that we're going to talk about a little bit later, but for now, let's just think about this as a competition, as an issue. So for Kodak, they really had no competition. They had these super efficient systems, which drove them to not really push on any kind of platform innovation. They had something going on in the lab, but they really didn't push to commercialize it. And what they were using was basically using old tests for new ideas. And so when this digital camera came out, they were saying, well, does it have the same quality? Does it have the same price? Does it have the same performance? Does it have the same output? No. And so the tests showed that this new technology to be suboptimal. However, Sony, what they did, breaking into a new market, was they came in and they ended up redefining the basis of competition. They didn't build the entire system. They had other people building parts of the system. We're going to talk about the processors and the hard disks and all those different pieces that came together. And what's more, Sony had intense competition from others. Pentax was working on a camera, Hitachi was working on one, Canon was working on one as well. And so Kodak had no competition. Sony had a very intense competition, and so we can see who had more incentive to innovate in a way into this market. So if we have these kind of competition constraints, what can we do? How can we overcome them? One thing is finding these new ways to compete. There are multiple kinds of innovation. I'm going to talk about it in a moment. We think about what are the different kinds of innovation that we could apply. There are different approaches to these multiple types of innovation. I'll show you one here. This is 10 types of innovation. This is a way of looking at innovation, the kinds of innovation that was first done by Larry Keeley at the Doblin Group in Chicago. What they did was they began to look at, across an industry, what are the different ways that people might actually compete? What are the different types of competition, in terms of their business model, in terms of the brand, in terms of product performance, in all these 10 different ways that they have here. And what Keeley found was that, interestingly, most organizations tended to try to go to the product performance, right? To basically make, if mine goes to 3 megahertz, yours goes at 4 megahertz, mine goes at 5 megahertz, mine goes at 6 megahertz. All about product performance. And people paid much less attention, organizations did much less innovating sort of at the outside edges, at the brand in terms of the business model and places like that. Also, what they did was they began to say, well, let me look over time. And in fact, you can see over time here, take these slices of time and begin to see where innovation is happening in the industry, in the different kinds of innovation. And so in a picture like this, you might start looking and say, well, how could I do some innovation in this area where there hasn't been very much innovation? And so the idea here is it doesn't tell you what to do, but it certainly tells you how to look at different aspects of your operations to say, if I were to innovate in this area, that might actually create a competitive advantage for me compared to other people. Also, if you put together a set of these in an industry, so in this case maybe the healthcare industry, you can begin to see patterns across them and pull together solutions that might actually span across many of these different places. And you could say, well, if I have brand in one area, how does that translate to brand in another area? And how can I use that as a basis for competitive innovation? So these multiple kinds of innovation, like these 10 types of innovation, really can show us new ways of competing. Another thing we can do is in our partnerships and alliances. Often organizations form partnerships in order to kill innovation. That is, like I explained, the T-Mobile and AT&T merger was really about AT&T not having to go through the work of innovating by creating their own 4G network. And so, but if we partner to learn and not to kill innovation, I think that's where we're going to get to a better place. We don't want to act like a monopoly, but we actually want to learn how to change things in a fundamental way. Another thing that happens in organizations and industries under competitive pressure is they begin to overinvest in efficiency. Well, if I make mine a little bit cheaper and make yours a little bit cheaper, make mine a little bit cheaper, that we try to make it super efficient in order to achieve those cost reductions. However, what that does is it sets up other organizations, other firms, other new entrants in a way that they're going to come into the market, but they're going to have to do it at such an cost advantage, that is in order to compete. Let me say that differently, a little confusing there. If I have a very efficient way of addressing a market the way Kodak did, any new entrant that comes in there is not going to be able to compete on those bases. They're going to have to find some other way to do it. And so to the extent that we overinvest in efficiency, we may be driving ourselves down a curve that is actually meaningless at the end because someone else is going to come in from a different direction. Next thing we know we have to do is develop new tests for new ideas. Kodak was using old tests for new ideas. That is, they had this new digital camera and they were saying, well, how does it compare with our old product? It didn't compare very well. But that was because it was different, right? You should have been compared on a different basis. And so if we don't develop these new tests for new ideas, it's going to be problematic. And so think about working on that. Next, we're going to talk about supplier constraints. That is, the suppliers that bring the raw material in and that provide the motive force in the industry.